Everyone, hope you're doing good. It is 12:45 Friday, sitting up in my makeshift office, just taking some notes, was doing some calls and everything. And I was just looking at some notes I took the other day, reflecting on some things that I was thinking about and wanted to share with you just as a word of encouragement. And all of us come from different backgrounds. And, um, and right now, um, the word that is thrown out a lot is anxiety. People are experiencing a lot of anxiety. There's a lot of uncertainty around things. Now, that's not the only feeling or the only behavior, right, that people are experiencing right now, but it's one that is really seemed to capture this time and place. And I mentioned background because how you were raised, the culture you're a part of, the environment you come up in will often determine how you understand anxiety and how you see anxiety. For a lot of people, anxiety was communicated to them that something must be wrong with them, that they, for example, in some faith communities, don't have enough faith, or they must have done something wrong, and so their anxiety is high. Other people may come from a non-faith background, but their culture or their family or their community communicated that anxiety was something just to muscle through and to work through, and you just got to get over it, right? And so we all have these ideas about how to work through anxiety. And there's lots of different thoughts I have, but for me, I take encouragement and hope in this thought I wanted to share with you, and that is for a lot of people, they grew up hearing this verse. There's this verse in the Bible, in the book in the Bible, Philippians, and the verse is Philippians 4:6. And Paul, who's an apostle, he says essentially, and I'm reading it right in front of me too, but it says, "Do not be anxious about anything." And so we've kind of taken that verse and said, okay, don't be anxious about anything. And we've completely ripped it out of context. And we've done a lot of damage in doing that, I think, to people. And I see that in the work that I do as a therapist and in my kind of past work, which I still do as working with people in ministry, that a lot of people are wounded because people say you shouldn't be anxious or something must be wrong with you. Paul says, don't be anxious. And then people end up in my office saying, I'm anxious. What do I do with that? And so that led me down this road many years ago to kind of look at that passage in context, right? And context is important. We have to look at, for example, the context of what's going on right now in our culture, that somebody might be struggling and we might project certain things onto them or have certain expectations. But if we pull the lens back, we see the bigger context. And in the bigger context, it makes sense. We have better understanding. We have better empathy for maybe a person's situation. And what's interesting for me in Philippians 4:6, that Paul uses this word for anxiety. My Greek is, it's been a while since I've read through Greek, but merimnao in Philippians 4:6, the word about anxiety, he uses that same word 2 chapters earlier in verse 2:20, where he talks about Timothy having anxiety. Same word, merimnao. But in 2:20, the anxiety is expressed as genuine care or concern for somebody. Timothy has anxiety for the community there in Philippi, the people that he loves and he's got a relationship with, right? So the same word, different context, same setting though, but different things happening. One to express, hey, don't have anxiety. The other to express, hey, anxiety is reflection of genuine care or concern. The best example I have of this is several years ago, my wife went with some of her friends and our neighbors to Africa, and we were driving in the car to the airport. And it was a kind of a quiet ride, I remember. And I remember just feeling anxious, and I didn't know what it was about. And I almost felt like I couldn't breathe, almost like a panic attack, when people have anxiety, if you've ever experienced that. It's just a horrible feeling. It wasn't extreme, but I could feel myself not breathing. And I remember the radio being off, and I was just not talking. And I remember thinking, man, why am I so anxious? And we pulled up to the curb, and she got out. And I remember giving her a hug, and I started to break down in tears. And I just said, I love you, and I got to go, right? I can't stay here longer. And I reflected on that on the car ride home, and I thought, what's my anxiety about? And to me, it was, oh, it's the anxiety that Paul writes about in 2:20, that my anxiety was indicative of the relationship I have with her, that there's genuine care and concern. So it's not a bad thing. My anxiety was not bad in that situation. It was, again, a reflection of the relationship I have with her and that many of you have with people in your lives. And so it's just interesting to me. And then later on in verse 226, so 6 verses later, Paul, he talks about, I always get this name wrong, I can't pronounce right, Epaphroditus, And he talks about him being distressed or depressed because Epaphroditus is worried that people are worried about him. And so just in this small book here in the Bible, in these small chapters, in these verses all combined, we get this flow of anxiety and this flow of depression seething kind of through the book, people really struggling. And then in 2 verses later, in chapter 2:28, Paul talks about the lessening of his anxiety. He uses a different word here for anxiety, but he talks about the lessening. So here's the guy who wrote, "Don't be anxious," but 2 chapters earlier, he's writing about his own anxiety. So it's not like he's never experienced anxiety before. I think we have this assumption that here's somebody who's never experienced anxiety and it must be wrong. He's saying, no, I've experienced it. The people I'm with right now are experiencing it, but mine has got lessened, and he's working on it. And so by the time he gets to 4:6, he comes to this place and he says, do not be anxious. But he doesn't stop there. He says, okay, kind of essentially the assumption is if you are anxious, here's what I want you to do about it instead. He says, in every situation, by prayer and petition. So in prayer and requesting, and then with thanksgiving, he says, present your request to God. And in verse 7, he says, and the peace of God, which transcends all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. So he's saying, if you don't be anxious, but if you are, go do these things. Here's some steps you can do. And I love too, in verse 8, he says, finally, brothers and sisters, whatever is true, whatever is noble, whatever is right, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is admirable, if anything is excellent or praiseworthy, think about such things. And he's way ahead of his time. He's essentially talking about, I'm going to use this language, but mindfulness in what we think about transforms what we believe. What we believe turns into actions, right? And now when I work with people in anxiety too, we talk a lot about this, that we can rewire the brain by thinking about different things, by meditating on different things, by practicing breathing techniques that allow us to enter into our anxiety and to reframe it as opportunities to grow. This is thousands of years ago. After he's talking about anxiety, he's saying, but think on these things, right? Think on these things, and it's going to bring this sense of peace and a sense of deep joy. And the whole book of Philippians is really about joy. That word is used numerous times. But joy is not tied to circumstance, because he's writing this letter from prison. He's writing in a community that's struggling. And most of you that are probably watching this, right, you're not in prison. You are probably struggling through this quarantine. You might be struggling relationally with people. You might be struggling with a job situation or finances. Stress might be super high, right? But the joy we can experience is not indicative, or not indicative. It's not dependent upon what we're experiencing, right? It's something deeper. I'm not really happy about a lot of things right now, but there's a deep joy that I'm experiencing at the same time in this difficult situation. And so this anxiety that you and I experience, it's normal. It's a part of being human. You can't be human and opt out of anxiety. And you're not alone. And people who tell you that something is wrong with you, or that you just need more faith, just flat out wrong. It's ripped out of context. And there are times that, anxiety is not helpful for us, but anxiety tends to point to the things that we need to work on and we need to grow on. It tends to show us the things that we care about. It tends to highlight and reflect to us things that matter to us and people that matter to us. And if we listen to anxiety, it can guide and lead us. It could guide and lead us to say, hey, you're anxious because these things you're doing, don't do these things anymore. They're not helpful to your life. Or you're anxious because these things matter to you, so lean into those things. But we don't know which direction to go until we enter in and lean into anxiety and reframe it as an opportunity to grow. And so for my own journey, I've tried to think about anxiety as being this friend, not an enemy who's trying to crush me, but a friend who's knocking on the door and wants in. And so I open the door. Right? I have the power here, and I let the anxiety come in and have a seat. Some authors talk about creating this environment and pouring a cup of tea and inviting anxiety into a conversation. And I love that metaphor because it takes the power out. And so I invite anxiety into my life. I open the door. I don't ignore it. I try to lock it out because that will lead to other destructive stuff. And in this friendship with it, I ask a lot of questions and I try to discern, I try to understand it. And ultimately it's in that discussion and in that relationship with my anxiety that I have growing discernment of how I should approach it. Should I work on this and changes things in my life to reduce anxiety? Or is anxiety something I need to lean into? There's lots of options here. And most often it's not done in a vacuum. This is done in conversation with people, family, close friends, counselors, pastors, co-workers, etc. I think it's helpful, and I wanted to share that with you. And you don't have to be part of a faith community or know anything about the book of Philippians or Paul to enter into this conversation. This topic of anxiety um, um, has its roots in great spiritual literature and non-spiritual literature, but thinkers and writers throughout, I don't know, I don't say thousands of years have written about it. There's great stuff on it. But ultimately, I think the deepest wisdom has always been is as an opportunity to really grow. So I wanted to share that with all of you, wanted to encourage you all that, and hope you have a good day.